Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to this week's University of Auckland Debating Society development seminar. I'm recording from a relatively dreary Christchurch. My name is Daniel. I've done lots of debatings and I've recorded quite a few of these videos in previous years. So if you have any interest in broadening your debating or want to listen to some more stuff, go onto the University of Auckland Facebook page and go to their playlists. There are lots of videos covering many different aspects of debating. But today we're looking very specifically at the role of a deputy speaker in British parliamentary debating. I have spoke Deputy is probably one of the more consistent positions that I've spoken across my time at university. And in my mind, it is the role within BP debating that brings out what I think is the most fun aspects of BP debating: the strategic decision making, the maneuvering. Like mainly, there's a comparison there with member. I really love both the positions, but deputy for me is often where I think you can do things that really make you shine in the BP format. For this seminar, I'll note that we're speaking about deputy in a very role-specific way, and sometimes people get a little bit too wrapped up in trying to be the best deputy speaker, the best prime minister speaker, or the best whip speaker, without necessarily spending the time on just being the best debater they can be. And there's a lot of things that you can do that don't really apply specifically to just being a deputy, but apply to all things. And if you are a deputy speaker, you should be trying to seek out that type of generalized knowledge and training as well. Things like working on your clarity, working on your word efficiency, and being engaged and charismatic. Thinking about what will make it easy for the judge to give us the win. Those are skills that are broader than just being a deputy, and you should learn those skills deeply and automatically. You should do things like no-note speeches and 5-minute prep speeches. And you should also review what you have done. Listen back to your speeches, record all of your practice speeches and all the speeches you give in a tournament. And remember, you should never inflict on a judge something you're not willing to listen to yourself. So make sure you familiarize yourself as much as you can with what are the aspects of your debating that are going well, what are the aspects that you want to improve on, and that comes from being very familiar with how you are speaking and actually seeing how your brain is laying out ideas from a little bit of a step back rather than just being within the speech. So on deputies, we're going to be speaking about 5 things. Firstly, talking about the ethos behind being a deputy, why I think deputy is a really fun position. Then we're going to be talking about framing, how you should be framing from deputy, then closing off your substantive contributions, then fourthly, how you should be approaching rebuttal, and finally, extensions. How are you going to be building the substantive contribution of your team within the debate? So on complementarity, your main ethos should be being a complement to the speaker that has come before you. And you want to be able to convince the judge that they have done an excellent job, and then that distinctly you have done an excellent job in bringing things forward. Because convincing a judge that there have been 2 excellent contributions that then build into a much larger than the sum of its parts contribution is better than merely just repeating what your earlier speaker has said or being entirely disconnected from what your earlier speaker has said. You need to be complementary there. And that can often be just as simple as stylistic. If you have a shouty first speaker, don't be a shouty first speaker. If your first speaker is quite slow and methodical, bring some more of that zip and zing to the debate. But you should be thinking about the ways in which you're engaging with that first speaker. So your first role is really to make your first speaker look fantastic. So speaking about the things that your first speaker has done, highlighting the things that they have done particularly well, and making sure that the judge is very aware of that. Because often, like when you are talking about your earlier speakers, you're actually recasting the way it has happened in the judge's mind, and you want to leave them with the impression that your first speaker has done a phenomenal job. But then you need to win the debate or contribute to your side's case with very distinct contributions. And this means probably the most important thing about being a deputy is being extremely aware of what your first speaker has said. If you're able to say, my first speaker said this and this, that means that you're able to highlight they did this very well. It means you're able to know this is the gap, and so I'm able to fill that gap in a very distinct way. I'm going to add this to the case. And then you can know exactly what you're doing additional, and you can highlight it for the judge. You can say, my first speaker said this, and I am building on that argument by doing X, Y, Z. So when you're thinking about your broader role as a deputy, it's about having that relationship with your first speaker where you make them look good and then are able to distinguish yourself from their contributions in a way that builds momentum within the debate and makes it clear to the judge that there've been 2 strong contributions within this debate. And actually, that's what the next 4 things I discussed essentially add up to. How do you build for the judge that feeling that there have been two very clean and valuable contributions within the case that has come from the opening team. So as to framing, very simply, what you should tell the judge when you're framing this debate is what is your team's contribution? What is the thing that you have added to the debate? Why is that something that matters? And then how you're going to grow that contribution. So once again, very distinctly, this is about your relationship with your first speaker. This is what you've heard, judge. Here's how it's going to change. Here's how it's going to evolve. Here's how it's going to become better and more important. That's really all you need to be thinking about in framing. It's not more complicated than that. What is the contribution from your team? How is that contribution going to grow from your deputy speech? So the three basically things you are more towards the anatomy of your deputy speech. There are three kind of things that you're trying to do. You're trying to make sure that the substantive contribution of your first speaker is valuable. You're trying to respond to the arguments that have been brought up by the opposition in terms of rebuttal, and you're trying to grow the substantive contribution of the debate and make it harder for your closing teams and give the judge more to kind of weigh when they're deciding what your contribution to the debate has been. So let's address the first one of those, which is how do you situate yourself relative to the contributions that have come from your first speaker? What's really important to note about being a deputy is it's your job to close off arguments. And that's how it's distinct from speaking a second and 3v3, where it's potentially a little bit more like you've got another two speakers actually coming after you who can kind of like fill in the gaps you leave. You can be a little bit less polished in terms of making sure that you're closing off those arguments. But remember that you are the last person from your team who is going to speak, and everyone else has a very strong vested interest to try and make it clear to the judge that you haven't closed those arguments. You haven't actually added anything to the debate. And this comes down to a little bit of actually the philosophical difference between 3v3 debating and BP debating. BP debating is substantially less rigorous than 3v3 debating. And that's because engagement is more random. People are worried about their thing, their contribution. There's no clear down the line team engagement where there's very little room to hide. There's a lot of room to hide in BP. A lot of things fall through the cracks. But the thing that makes BP quite cool is there's a broader strategic thinking when you have this kind of messy environment with four teams, all very self-interested, engaging in a kind of random way. And the strategic focus that you kind of need to have is how do I make people talk about me and talk about my material, but are unable to defeat it. The unable to defeat it thing is kind of simple. You just build up your analysis as much as possible. But in order to make sure that people focus on you and in order to make sure that your arguments are durable, you need to close off those arguments and make it clear that each of the steps to that argument have been finished or completed. And in some ways, it kind of matches what you'll be doing in reply or doing as a third speaker in a 3v3 style. The way in which judges often weigh the contributions then is not just in adding diffuse kind of open-ended material, but having very clear tools the judge can use to understand the issue. So say you have a bit of analysis in the debate about like bargaining power. You want to be the bargaining power team. You want to make sure that the judge from your speech has a very strong theoretical understanding of bargaining power and then a very strong understanding of how that tool that they now have within the debate applies to different interests that are important in the debate. Here's how it applies to this point, how it applies to this point. And at the end of your speech, you kind of want to be able to list off what are the things that have come out of our speech. We've explained to you how bargaining power is relevant by leading to this outcome. We've explained to you how there's imperfect information which addresses this, and this. We've really owned this particular minority issue and explaining how it has that effect. And then the judge, obviously, at the end of the debate, when they're weighing everything, will be like, well, there's one team that had a lot of interesting things to say, but I didn't give me distinct things that I can weigh, but this team has like three really clear things that I can use to weigh this debate. And you want to be able to close off those arguments and make sure that the judge can cleanly see this is what you have contributed to the debate. So when you're addressing the substantive contributions of your first speaker, what you should do is very, very quickly, so like your first point of clash, here's what my first speaker said. They've said this, they've said this, they've said this, and this leads to a complete point which the judge will hopefully then be able to take away and weigh on its own merit. When you are skimming through that, you should try and identify the gaps that your first speaker has left. And they've only had 15 minutes to prep. There will be some gaps in the way they do it. And sometimes you can just kind of like subtly backfill it by saying, and I want to highlight this aspect that they spent too little time on it and give a little bit more detail. Or sometimes you'll just be like, my first speaker said this, this, and this. And what I add here is this impacting or this mechanism, or making it really clear how you're improving that argument or bringing that argument up. It's very important not to waste time repeating material. It's your job to repackage material in a really quick way so that the judge can then skim through and be like, yep, I think that argument has been made. And it's your job to make sure that any gaps in those arguments have been completed. So make sure you're listening to what your leader has said, try and get a sense from what your leader has missed. Ask the leader, where do you think the point is weak? Think in a systematic way about like, is all the context that we need there? Are the mechanisms that we need there? Is the impacting that we need there? Is the weighing that we need there in order to get to that kind of collective endpoint? This is also, and then often what I'll do is after I've gone through that skim and filled in any gaps I need to do, what has the opposition said? So addressing the ways in which they've tried to engage with it. I think the first thing to note is that you should be kind of grouping the responses from the opposition. You don't want to be necessarily doing hyper-specific, line-by-line defenses of all of the different responses that they bring, because there's going to be so many responses within the debate that it tends to be a waste of time to go through them that distinctly. So what you should do is group the responses and then respond to those responses. So say, for example, if they've brought like 4 responses and really 3 of them are quite similar and one of them is quite distinct in the way that you will respond to them, list those out. So the first way they tried to defeat it is they said 1, 2, 3. Those 3 things are not effective against our point because of X. And then you go into the way in which you fix it. And if you hold yourself to that type of like intense grouping and then ask yourself, what is the basic fundamental behind this response or the reason I've collected up these responses, making sure that you then build a robust response to those types of defeats rather than a specific response to those types of rebuttals. So saying the first thing they attack us is on a number of ways of saying, well, this actor is just too stupid to kind of engage with this thing in the way that we say it is. So what I'm going to respond is I'm going to deal with all of those types of responses, which just means then if the closing team brings a different variation on the, well, actually, no, they're kind of dumb, or they're not able to weigh things in a rational way, you have your specific, here's why that's not the case. Here's why they are rational. Here's how they're able to make decisions. And then at the end of that, you'll hopefully have an argument from your first speaker that is clear. You've filled in all the gaps. You've dealt with the way they responded. And then you can add any bigger things that you think are necessary. So pivoting into like a bigger group, or explaining how it is cross-application, or really just cementing for the judge the value of that tool that has been added within the debate. So let's talk about rebuttal now. And I think the first thing to note is that just as with when you're grouping the responses of the opposition, you don't want to be line by line. You also don't really want to be line by line when you're responding to the other team's material as well, because no doubt if they have done a bad job, the better version of that point will come out in the closing team. So what you want to do is figure out what opportunities you have in rebuttal to go beyond the specific assertions of the other opening team towards any way in which that particular type of argument can be made. And you have to be kind of subtle here, because you don't necessarily want to give the opposition the best version of those arguments, but you want to make it very clear that your responses, and you might need to bring this back up in a POI and be like, doesn't our response here also deal with your analysis, responds to the best version of that point, or puts it deeply beyond doubt. And I also think this is a useful mental technique to try and encompass, because it makes you, again, much more efficient. So if you're trying to address the strongest version of that argument, you make sure you are not being lazy and not wasting lots of time chasing that kind of low-hanging fruit of poorly constructed arguments. And that really just kind of is the basis of your rebuttal. You want to engage with things to their best degree of arguments, clashing them where necessary against your own material. So sometimes, obviously, you'll have like a clash point that is kind of like you had a point and they had a point in direct tension. And so you kind of just weave that into how you are dealing with like the substantive material or their responses to your substantive material. But you're looking for those broad application opportunities. So last thing to discuss is extension material. And this, I think, is where deputies become like really quite fun, because you're trying to build the debate in a way that then catapults you into the closing teams or forces the closing teams to try and engage with you as well. The first thing to note is that you should not just have distinct, like, oh, here's an extra point types of extensions. That's a very limited conception of what an extension is. An extension is actually any contribution that you have brought that goes beyond what your earlier speaker has said. And that applies to you if you're deputy and applies to you if you're a closing team. You should try and turn rebuttal and the rebuilding of your substantive material into extensions if they are significant contributions. So say, for example, you have one point and they've brought an excellent bit of rebuttal that is really that really kind of like builds their whole case off of. Your response to that can just as meaningfully be your extension within the debate, or really what you're adding to the debate, as, for example, a distinct point that hasn't yet been touched on. And you just want to make it really clear to the judge how the debate is changing at that point, how you're building it, and how the other teams will have to be forced to engage with you when they come along or try and shift the debate onto their own grounds. So you should not, and I also think it's important not to try and fill any formulaic, I need an extension, or I need XYZ, or I need to burn all the material within the debate, so I just need to throw as much in as possible. Don't waste time on a distinct extension unless it is good. So if there is one bit of rebuttal that you give that you think could be really debate winning if you spent a lot of time building up, do it. Like spend the time on the material that you think is strong, that you think is valuable, and don't get caught in the technical or people's stereotypes of what an extension looks like. An extension looks like anything you're doing that is going beyond that first speaker and is building out the debate. I think there's one caveat to this, and that's don't waste time on a distinct extension unless you think it really could be good. And I think this is probably one of the most dangerous gambles that every deputy will have to play off. And that's, oh gosh, there's been a POI to the opening opposition or towards the opening government from the team on your bench that kind of gives away what their extension is going to be. How much do you want to try and burn that material or make it so that the opposition can't use it? I think the first thing to remember is that your time is really precious within the debate. So it is not generally worth spending time on something unless you can make it into a good point or a good contribution from your own team. And to be fair, if someone gives a POI and it's not indicating an extension that you think is going to be particularly strong, you don't really have to burn that material because they'll make it and it won't be as strong as the material that you spend the rest of your time discussing. But very efficient deputies are good at going through the motions of like really promising extensions in ways that even if you can't eke all of the value out of it, so obviously if you're able to spend 3 minutes on something instead of 1 minute on something, you'd be able to give it to a greater level of detail and power that nonetheless can completely crowd the opposition off that material, because they can add all of the bells and whistles, but unless they are once again being very distinct, here is what the deputy said, here's how the bells and whistles that we add are so meaningful in the debate to be a contribution above both their setting up at that point and their original material. And that's like quite difficult for a closing team to do that, to be quite a high level closing team, to be able to break that debate down in detail. Often it'll lead them to be pushed off your argument and either run the argument in a way that doesn't recognize what you have added to the debate, and then often judges will dismiss that material as just being derivative, or they'll just back off that material entirely because they think that they might be called out for being derivative, and then they're left with much weaker points. This is obviously a risk, because whenever you undermake material, and this is why I think it's like generally a bad idea to make a deputy speech just like 40 unconnected arguments that like that kind of just try and burn everything in the debate so the opposition can't use it. Because if you make any gaps in that material or you undermake it mechanistically, that can be exploited by closing teams. And I think this probably matches the advice that I give to closing teams as well. Be very on the ball for when your opening team thinks they have burned material, but they actually haven't, and they've just left you a really like nice framing for the strong mechanisms that you'll be able to fill that with. So the kind of skill that you want to be able to develop is a sense for what are the kind of key arguments that we have left on the table. How can I make the bulk of those arguments in a really efficient like 30-second way, blasting through the context, mechanisms that play out, the impacts weighing, so that when the judge is considering their notes, even if they don't at first appreciation think the material is particularly strong, they probably will say, okay, but if I'm crediting the material that is made better from the closing team, I probably should give some of that credit to the opening team as well. It's figuring out how to not waste a lot of time on burning material, but still do a comprehensive enough job that it makes it difficult for the other teams to try and come back and steal that material, because you have done a relatively good job, even if it's not a perfect job, of pushing them off that material. That, I think, is generally the key things you need to remember when you're doing a deputy speech. It is a speech like any other. Most of the time, you'll be judged on the quality of the arguments that you bring and the way that you do it. But there are, as I've walked through, a couple of things you can do and keep in mind. Chief among them, I need to be adding a distinct contribution, and I need to leave the judge with things they can actually weigh within the debate, not just the starts of arguments or little fragments of arguments. Or arguments that have a lot of potential, arguments that are closed, completed, and then as much material as possible to crowd out what my closing team is doing, force the other closing team to engage with my material, to leave in that judge's mind, this is the team that is going to win this debate. Neat. If you have any questions, feel free to flick me a message. Deputy is a lot of fun. You should try and speak in every position. Give yourself as broad an appreciation of all the different needs of the positions as possible, even if you decide after doing all that experimenting, one is really for you, because learning what the other speakers need is one of the major ways you can build up your own contribution in your specialist position.